At my father's funeral, my stepmother announced I was adopted. He never loved you anyway, she whispered. And said everything goes to my son. The mourners gasped. I said nothing, just handed the lawyer an envelope I'd been saving. For this exact moment. The words hit me like ice water in the middle of my father's eulogy. Karen's breath was warm against my ear, but her whisper carried the chill of pure malice. You were adopted. He never really loved you anyway. I stood frozen in the front pew of St. Mark's Chapel, my hands gripping the funeral program so tightly that my knuckles had gone white. Around us, mourners shifted uncomfortably as Karen's voice suddenly rose, loud enough for everyone to hear. Everything goes to my son. That's what Thomas wanted. The gasps from the congregation felt distant, like I was underwater. This moment, this exact devastating moment, was what I'd been preparing for without even knowing it. 4 months, I'd sensed something building, something dark and calculated behind Karen's concerned smiles and Charles's newfound confidence around the house. Before we continue, I want to thank you for joining me in sharing these stories that reveal the power of truth and family bonds. If you believe that love and justice should always triumph over manipulation and lies, please consider subscribing. It's free and helps us reach more people who need to hear these stories of resilience. Now let's see how this unfolds. But let me back up. Let me tell you how we got here, to this chapel where my father's body lay in a casket he would have hated. Too fancy, too expensive, chosen by a woman who'd known him for only 6 years. Dad died on a Tuesday. A massive heart attack at the construction site where he'd been working on a custom home for the Johnsons. At 57, Thomas Mitchell was supposed to have decades left. He was supposed to walk me down the aisle someday, meet his grandchildren, retire to that little cabin he'd been dreaming about up north. Instead, his foreman found him collapsed next to a stack of lumber, his tool belt still around his waist. The call came from Karen, not the hospital. I was in my cubicle at Brennan Marketing reviewing campaign proposals, when my phone buzzed with her number. Something about her tone immediately set my teeth on edge. Not grief exactly, but something more controlled, more rehearsed. Susan, you need to sit down, she said, and I could hear Charles in the background asking questions. Your father. Thomas had a heart attack this morning. He's gone. Gone. Such a simple word for something so catastrophic. I remember dropping my coffee mug, watching the brown liquid spread across my desk while Karen continued talking about arrangements and decisions that needed to be made. But what struck me most was how quickly she moved past the grief and into logistics. I know this is hard, but we need to be practical, she said. Thomas left very specific instructions about how he wanted things handled. That should have been my first red flag. Dad wasn't the type to leave detailed instructions about anything. He was spontaneous, adaptive, the kind of man who figured things out as he went along. But grief has a way of making you doubt your own memories, doesn't it? The next few days blurred together in a haze of funeral homes and flower arrangements. Karen took charge with an efficiency that was almost militaristic. She scheduled meetings with the funeral director, chose the casket, selected the music, all while I sat in my childhood home feeling like a guest who'd overstayed her welcome. You don't need to worry about any of this, she kept saying. I know how Thomas would have wanted things. But did she? When she chose the mahogany casket with gold handles, I thought about how Dad had always preferred simple, functional things. When she selected classical music for the service, I remembered how he used to blast classic rock while working in his garage. Every choice felt wrong, but every time I tried to voice an opinion, Karen would pat my hand and remind me how emotional I was being. The estate details were where things got truly strange. Karen claimed Dad had left everything organized in a sealed envelope in their bedroom safe. She wouldn't let me see it, wouldn't let me speak to his lawyer directly, wouldn't even tell me what bank held his accounts. Thomas wanted to keep things simple, she'd say whenever I asked questions. You'll understand soon enough. Simple. There was that word again. Nothing about Karen's behavior felt simple. I started noticing other things too. How she'd already begun boxing up Dad's personal items, starting with the photos of me from elementary school that used to sit on his dresser. How she spoke about the house like it was already hers, making plans for renovations and talking about finally updating this old place. How Charles had suddenly become so comfortable in what had been my father's domain. Charles, 22 years old and acting like he'd inherited a kingdom. He'd moved into Dad's house 6 years ago when Karen married my father, but he'd always maintained a respectful distance. Dad had tried to connect with him, teaching him to use tools, inviting him to job sites, treating him like the son he'd never had. But Charles had always seemed more interested in his video games and his friends than in building any real relationship with Thomas. Now suddenly he was Dad, this and Dad, that to anyone who would listen. I caught him on his phone one afternoon, talking to someone about property values in the area, while taking pictures of different rooms in the house. When I asked him about it, he just shrugged and said he was getting familiar with Dad's assets. Assets. As if my father was just a collection of things to be appraised and divided. The most disturbing moment came 3 days before the funeral. I'd stopped by the house to pick up the suit Dad had wanted to be buried in, a navy blue one he'd worn to my college graduation. I found Charles in Dad's workshop, not using any tools or working on any projects, just sitting in Dad's chair and looking around like he was planning a renovation. "This would make a great game room," he said when he saw me. "Dad always said he wanted me to make better use of this space." Dad had never said that. In fact, Dad had been protective of his workshop, the one place in the house where he could escape and work with his hands. It was his sanctuary, filled with half-finished projects and tools organized with the precision of a man who took pride in his craft. The idea of Charles turning it into a game room would have broken Dad's heart. But I didn't say anything. I just collected the suit and left, feeling more and more like an intruder in the home where I'd grown up. The worst part was how isolated I felt. At 33, I was still figuring out my place in the world. My career was stable but not passionate, my love life was a series of almosts and not quites, and Dad had been my constant, my anchor in a world that often felt uncertain. Losing him was like losing my compass, and Karen's behavior was making everything so much worse. I'd started to question my own memories. Maybe I was being paranoid. Maybe grief was making me see conspiracies where there were none. Maybe this was just how families handled death, with one person taking charge while others tried to process their loss. But then there were the phone calls. I tried calling Dad's cell phone several times in the weeks before he died, just to check in, but Karen always answered. "He's resting," she'd say. "His heart can't handle stress right now." Yet Charles was always there, always around, always talking to Thomas about plans and futures that apparently didn't include me. When I'd asked if I could visit, Karen had a dozen reasons why it wasn't a good time. He was sleeping. He was having a bad day. The doctor had said no visitors. But somehow Charles never counted as a visitor. Now sitting in this chapel listening to Karen's poisonous whisper still echoing in my ears, everything clicked into place. The isolation, the secrecy, the way she'd positioned herself as the gatekeeper to my own father. It had all been building to this moment. This moment where she thought she could destroy me with a lie about adoption, where she could claim my father's legacy for her son, where she could erase 33 years of love and history with a few cruel words. But Karen had made one crucial mistake. She'd underestimated how well I knew my father, and she'd underestimated how much I'd learned from him about planning ahead and protecting what matters most. The envelope in my purse felt heavy with possibility as I reached for it, my decision already made. The silence that followed Karen's declaration was deafening. For a heartbeat, the entire chapel seemed suspended in time, as if everyone was processing what they'd just witnessed. Then the whispers began. Soft at first like rustling leaves, before growing into a low murmur that filled the sacred space with uncomfortable tension. I felt every eye in the room on me waiting for my reaction. Some faces showed genuine shock, mouths slightly agape as they tried to reconcile Karen's words with their memories of watching me grow up in this very community. Mrs. Henderson from next door covered her mouth with her gloved hand, her eyes wide behind thick glasses. She'd been there when Dad brought me home from the hospital 33 years ago. Behind me, I could hear the distinctive voice of Frank Kolsky, Dad's longest-running client, whispering urgently to his wife, "That can't be right." I remember Tommy showing me baby pictures when Susan was just weeks old. He was over the moon about that little girl. But it wasn't shock that kept me rooted to the spot. It was the sheer magnitude of self-control required to not let Karen see how deeply her words had cut. Every muscle in my body was coiled tight, my breathing carefully measured. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat, but my face remained a mask of calm composure. Karen's transformation was breathtaking in its completeness. The grieving widow facade she'd maintained for days simply evaporated. Her tears, which I now realized had been more performance than genuine emotion, dried up instantly. When our eyes met across the small distance between us, I saw something that chilled me to the bone. Triumph. Pure cold satisfaction. You should have never presumed to plan this service, she hissed, her voice pitched just loud enough for the first 3 rows to hear clearly. The artificial sweetness that usually coated her words was gone, replaced by razor-sharp malice. You're not even blood. You have no right to be here making decisions about Thomas's final goodbye. The audible gasps from nearby mourners made her smile, actually smile, at my father's funeral. It was a subtle expression, barely a upturn of her lips, but unmistakable to anyone watching closely. She was enjoying this. Behind her, Charles shifted nervously, clearly uncomfortable with his mother's sudden shift in demeanor but not brave enough to intervene. I watched him fidget with his tie, Dad's tie, I realized with a fresh stab of pain, while trying to gauge the room's reaction to his mother's performance. Ruth Martinez, my godmother and Dad's oldest friend, reached for my arm with tears streaming down her weathered face. She'd known me since birth, had been there for every birthday, every milestone, every moment that mattered. Her touch was gentle, protective, but I carefully pulled away. Let her speak, I said softly, my voice somehow carrying across the chapel despite its quiet tone. It's her moment too. The simple statement seemed to shift something in the room's energy. Several people straightened in their pews, suddenly paying closer attention. My calmness in the face of Karen's attack was clearly not what they'd expected, and I could see confusion flickering across faces throughout the congregation. Old Pete Garrison, one of Dad's original construction crew, was frowning deeply from the 4th row. I caught his eye and saw something that gave me hope, doubt. Not about me but about Karen. His weathered hands were clenched on his knees, and I could practically see him remembering every interaction he'd had with her over the years, re-evaluating everything through this new lens. This is exactly what Thomas would have wanted, Karen continued, her voice growing bolder as she fed off the attention. For family, real family, to honor his memory properly. That's when Charles stepped forward, and I had to admire the coaching his mother had given him. At 22 he was trying to project an authority that felt foreign on his young features, but his delivery was surprisingly smooth. Dad always wanted us to have the house, he said, his voice carrying more confidence than I'd ever heard from him before. He paused, letting his words sink in before adding, he told us privately that family comes first. Blood family. The way he looked at me when he said blood family was meant to appear sympathetic, but I caught the calculation behind it. This wasn't grief speaking, this was strategy. Karen had prepared him for this moment, probably rehearsed it multiple times. Several mourners were nodding along, caught up in Charles's performance. After all, he looked the part of the grieving stepson, standing tall in his borrowed suit, speaking about family values at his father's funeral. To someone who didn't know the family dynamics, it probably seemed reasonable. But I noticed the subtle cracks in his facade. His hands were trembling slightly, and he kept glancing at his mother for approval after each statement. This was probably the most responsibility he'd ever been given, the first time Karen had trusted him to play such a crucial role in one of her schemes. It's what Dad wanted, he repeated as if saying it multiple times would make it more true. He made that very clear to both of us. The room was dividing before my eyes. Some people, mostly those who'd known our family for years, were looking increasingly uncomfortable with Karen and Charles's performance. Others, particularly the newer acquaintances and Karen's friends, seemed to be buying into the narrative they were selling. I could feel the weight of their expectations, the pressure to defend myself, to argue, to break down and prove Karen right about my emotional instability. But instead I reached into my purse with deliberate slowness, my movements calm and purposeful. The envelope had been there for months, growing heavier with each passing day. I'd carried it to work, to the grocery store, to every place I'd gone since the day I'd first suspected what was coming. Part of me had hoped I'd never need to use it, that my paranoia was just grief playing tricks on my mind. Mr. Whitaker had just entered through the chapel's side door, probably having driven straight from his office after hearing about the disturbance. His silver hair was slightly disheveled, and he was adjusting his glasses as he took in the scene before him. He'd been Dad's lawyer for over 15 years, had handled everything from business contracts to Dad's divorce from my mother when I was 12. The envelope felt both weightless and impossibly heavy as I extended it toward him. Every eye in the chapel was on me now, the whispers dying down as people sensed something significant was about to happen. "Play it," I said simply, my voice steady and clear. Mr. Whitaker took the envelope with professional composure, though I caught the slight widening of his eyes as he recognized what I was handing him. Behind me, I heard Karen's sharp intake of breath, the first genuine emotion she'd shown since her performance began. The chapel fell completely silent, the weight of anticipation settling over everyone like a heavy blanket. Even Charles stopped fidgeting, his youthful confidence suddenly wavering as he realized his mother's script hadn't prepared him for this particular development. The moment stretched between us, pregnant with possibility and retribution, as Mr. Whitaker opened the envelope with careful, practiced fingers. Mr. Whitaker's fingers paused over the flash drive as he examined it, recognition flickering across his weathered face. He'd handled this type of recording before. Emergency messages, final wishes, the desperate attempts of clients who sensed their time was running short. But the careful way he held it, the slight nod he gave me, suggested he knew exactly what this was. "What is this nonsense?" Karen's voice cut through the chapel's silence like broken glass. But something had changed in her tone. The confident cruelty was wavering, replaced by the first thread of genuine fear. "You can't just interrupt a funeral service with some amateur recording." She was moving toward us now, her heels clicking sharply against the chapel's polished floor. Several mourners turned to watch her approach, and I caught the exact moment when her mask slipped further. The calculated composure she'd maintained was cracking, revealing something desperate underneath. Mr. Whitaker connected the flash drive to the chapel's sound system with professional efficiency, his movements deliberate despite Karen's protests. The small device looked insignificant as it plugged into the port, but I knew the power it contained. Months of planning, of waiting for this exact moment, had led to this single piece of technology. "Susan, what are you doing?" Karen demanded, but her voice was higher now, strained. "This is inappropriate. Thomas wouldn't want." She never finished the sentence. Dad's voice filled the chapel with the clarity of digital recording, and the entire room went dead silent. It was his voice, unmistakably, but carrying a weight I hadn't heard in the final months of his life. Not the tired, defeated man Karen had painted him as, but the father I remembered, determined, protective, and finally free to speak his truth. "To my daughter Susan." Those 4 words hit me like a physical force. I felt my carefully maintained composure threaten to crumble as tears burned behind my eyes for the first time since entering the chapel. But I held them back, needing to stay strong for what was coming next. The timestamp on the recording was clear in Dad's careful pronunciation. Tuesday, March 15th, 7:30 p.m. Just 1 week before the heart attack that took him. While Karen had been telling everyone he was too weak for visitors, too fragile for emotional stress, he'd been gathering the strength to make this recording. "I'm sorry I let Karen come between us these past months." His voice continued, each word deliberate and measured. "I should have been stronger. I should have protected you from her manipulation, but I was scared of being alone again. That fear made me weak and it cost us precious time together." I heard a sharp intake of breath from someone behind me, followed by a whispered, "Oh my God," that I recognized as Mrs. Peterson from the church auxiliary. She'd known Dad for 20 years, had watched him struggle through his divorce from my mother, had seen how devoted he was to me throughout my childhood. Karen was backing away from the speakers now, her face cycling through expressions of shock, anger, and something that looked almost like terror. Charles remained frozen in place, his mouth slightly open as he processed hearing the man he'd called Dad, speaking with such clarity about manipulation and lies. "I love you," Dad's voice filled every corner of the chapel. "I always have. You are my heart, my legacy, my pride. Nothing Karen has told you changes that. Nothing anyone could ever say would change that." The words washed over me like a warm embrace, and I felt something inside my chest that had been tightly wounded for months finally begin to loosen. This was my father, not the distant, controlled man Karen had presented to the world, but the dad who had taught me to change my own oil, who had stayed up all night helping me with school projects, who had been my biggest cheerleader at every stage of my life. Blood or not, it never mattered to me. The recording continued, and I saw several older mourners nodding in recognition. They remembered the joy on Dad's face when he brought me home from the hospital, the pride in his voice when he talked about his daughter. "But I know the truth now about everything Karen has told you. About everything she's told me." Karen made a strangled sound, something between a gasp and a sob, but there was no genuine emotion in it. Even now, she was calculating, trying to figure out how to regain control of the situation. She made you believe I didn't want to see you. Dad's voice grew stronger, more determined. She told you I was disappointed in your choices, angry about your career, upset that you weren't married yet. All lies, Susan. Every single word was a lie designed to keep us apart. Charles was staring at his mother now with something approaching horror. His face had gone pale and I could see his hands shaking slightly. Whether from anger or shock I couldn't tell, but the confident young man who'd been making claims about inheritance just minutes earlier was nowhere to be seen. She told me you said I wasn't really your father, the recording revealed, and the collective gasp from the congregation was audible. That you'd found your real family and didn't need an old construction worker anymore. I believed her, Susan. God help me, I believed her because I was already feeling so lost after your mother left, so afraid of being abandoned again. Ruth was crying openly now, her hands pressed to her mouth as she listened to the systematic destruction of Karen's careful web of lies. Around the chapel, I could see the dawning realization on face after face as people began to understand the scope of what had been happening. I want to set things right before it's too late, Dad's voice continued with growing urgency. I need you to know that every day we've been apart has been agony for me. Every holiday, every birthday, every milestone I've missed because I was too proud and too scared to reach out directly. Karen convinced me you needed space, that contact from me would only hurt you more. The recording paused for a moment and I could hear Dad taking a shaky breath before continuing. When his voice returned, it carried a steel that I recognized from my childhood, the tone he used when he absolutely would not be moved. But I see clearly now. I see what she's done, how she's poisoned both of us against each other for her own purposes. And I won't let her win, Susan. Not anymore. You are my daughter in every way that matters and I love you more than my own life. Karen was backing toward the chapel's exit now, her eyes darting between the speakers and the faces turned toward her with growing suspicion and disgust. But Charles remained rooted in place, his world clearly crumbling around him as he listened to the man he'd thought loved him reveal the truth about their relationship. The weight I'd been carrying for months, the doubt, the grief, the terrible fear that maybe I really had lost my father's love, finally lifted from my shoulders completely. Dad's voice faded into silence, leaving the chapel suspended in a moment so profound that even the sound of breathing seemed amplified. The weight of his words hung in the air like incense, permeating every corner of the sacred space. For 30 seconds, maybe more, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The revelation of Karen's systematic manipulation was still sinking in, creating ripples of understanding that spread from pew to pew. That's when I reached into my purse again. The second envelope was noticeably thicker than the first, its manila surface slightly worn from months of careful handling. My fingers found it easily. I'd checked its presence obsessively for weeks, the way some people check for their keys or wallet. But now, for the first time since I'd received these documents, my hands were perfectly steady. Gone was the anxiety that had plagued me for months, the sleepless nights spent wondering if I was losing my mind, if grief was making me paranoid. In its place was something I hadn't felt in a long time: absolute certainty. Purpose. The satisfaction of preparation meeting opportunity. I extended the envelope toward Mr. Whitaker, and this time he didn't hesitate. His professional composure remained intact despite the extraordinary circumstances unfolding in what should have been a simple funeral service. He accepted the envelope with the same careful attention he'd shown the first, but I caught the slight raise of his eyebrows as he felt its weight. What now? Karen's voice cracked like a whip through the silence, but the authority was gone. She sounded like what she was: a woman watching her carefully constructed house of lies collapse in real time. What other dramatic nonsense are you planning to inflict on your father's funeral? But even as she spoke, she was edging closer to us, her eyes fixed on the envelope with something approaching terror. Whatever composure she'd managed to rebuild during Dad's recording was evaporating fast. Mr. Whitaker opened the envelope with methodical precision, his lawyer's training keeping his movements calm and deliberate. The papers inside rustled softly as he extracted them, and I watched his eyes scan the letterheads and official seals before he looked up to address the room. "These are DNA paternity test results," he announced, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to delivering life-changing news. 2 separate tests, both processed through Gene Tech Laboratories, which is fully accredited and recognized by the American Association of Blood Banks. The collective intake of breath from the congregation was audible. Several people leaned forward in their pews, straining to hear every word. In the front row, Ruth had her hand pressed to her chest, her eyes wide with anticipation and something that looked like vindication. Mr. Whitaker held up the first document. The first test compares DNA samples from Susan Mitchell and Thomas Mitchell. He paused, letting the full weight of that statement settle before continuing. The probability of paternity is 99.97%. Susan Mitchell is definitively the biological daughter of Thomas Mitchell. The gasps this time were followed by murmurs of "I knew it," and "of course she is" from Dad's longtime friends. Mrs. Henderson was nodding emphatically, tears streaming down her face as 33 years of memories were validated in an instant. But it was the second document that would change everything. The second test, Mr. Whitaker continued, his voice steady despite the drama unfolding before him, compares DNA samples from Charles Thompson and Thomas Mitchell. Another pause, this one longer, more loaded with consequence. The probability of paternity is 0%. Charles Thompson is definitively not the biological son of Thomas Mitchell. The silence that followed was different from before, heavier, more charged. It was the silence of a room full of people processing a revelation that shattered everything they thought they knew about the family dynamics they'd been witnessing. Charles made a sound like he'd been punched in the stomach. It was a small noise, barely audible, but in the perfect quiet of the chapel it might as well have been a scream. His face had gone completely white, and I watched as his legs seemed to give out slightly. He reached for the back of a pew to steady himself, his eyes darting between his mother and the papers in Mr. Whitaker's hands. "That's not possible." Karen's shriek shattered the silence like breaking glass. All pretense of dignified grief was gone now, replaced by raw panic. "Those tests are fake. She manipulated them somehow." She lunged toward Mr. Whitaker, her hands outstretched as if she could somehow make the truth disappear by destroying the physical evidence. But Ruth was faster than I expected for a woman in her 70s. She stepped directly into Karen's path, her small frame surprisingly formidable as she blocked the larger woman's advance. "You sit down and shut your mouth," Ruth said, her voice carrying decades of authority from teaching Sunday school and managing church committees. "You've done enough damage." Two other women from the congregation, faces I recognized but couldn't immediately name, flanked Ruth, creating a human barrier between Karen and the lawyer. Their expressions ranged from disgust to outright anger as they stared down the woman who had systematically destroyed a father-daughter relationship with lies and manipulation. "You manipulated a dying man." Karen screamed, but her voice was breaking now, desperation bleeding through every word. "She probably forged these documents. She's been planning this, plotting against us." But even as she spoke, I could see she knew how hollow her protestations sounded. 6 months ago, when I'd first ordered these tests, I'd been careful to follow every legal protocol. I'd used Dad's hairbrush for his sample, collected during one of the few visits Karen had allowed. My own sample had been taken at a certified facility with proper documentation. The chain of custody was unbreakable. Mr. Whitaker seemed to read my thoughts. "These tests were processed through an accredited laboratory 6 months ago," he announced to the room. "I personally oversaw the chain of custody to ensure their legal validity. The samples were collected properly, the testing was conducted according to industry standards, and the results are legally admissible." Charles was staring at his mother now with an expression I'd never seen on his young face before. The confident entitlement that had characterized his behavior for weeks was completely gone, replaced by something raw and betrayed. "Mom," he whispered, and his voice cracked like a teenager's. "You told me he was my real dad. You said my biological father was dead. You said Thomas adopted me because he loved me like his own son." Karen's head snapped toward her son, and for a moment I saw something flicker across her face that might have been genuine emotion. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by the calculating coldness I'd grown to recognize. "He did love you," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "These tests don't change that. Family isn't about blood, it's about..." "Don't." The word came from my mouth with more force than I'd intended. Every eye in the chapel turned to me as I stood there, my hands clenched at my sides, months of suppressed anger finally finding its voice. You knew, I said, my voice steady despite the earthquake happening inside my chest. That's why you tried to humiliate me today. You knew your son wasn't his biological child, and you were terrified that I actually was. The truth hung between us like a challenge, undeniable and devastating. Around the chapel, I could see understanding dawn on face after face as people began to grasp the full scope of Karen's deception. You spent 6 years building a lie, I continued, my voice growing stronger with each word. And when Dad started to see through it, when he began questioning your stories about me, you knew you had to act fast. The words hung in the air between us, sharp and accusatory, as I watched Karen's face cycle through emotions like a slot machine. But before she could formulate another desperate lie, Mr. Whitaker cleared his throat with the kind of authority that comes from 40 years of legal practice. There's one more document, he said, reaching into his briefcase with deliberate movements. The leather case was old and well-worn, the kind that spoke of a career built on handling life's most important moments. The last will and testament of Thomas Mitchell, updated and properly witnessed. The effect on Karen was immediate and devastating. Whatever color had remained in her face drained completely, leaving her looking almost gray in the chapel's soft lighting. Her mouth opened and closed soundlessly like a fish gasping for air. "That's impossible," she managed to whisper, but her voice had lost all its fight. "The will is in our safe at home. I have the only copy." Mr. Whitaker's smile was professionally polite but carried the weight of absolute certainty. "Mrs. Thompson, your husband made significant changes to his will just 4 days before his passing. This was done in my office with 2 independent witnesses present, both certified notaries, while he was of completely sound mind and without any external pressure." Karen's eyes darted around the chapel as if looking for an escape route. "He couldn't have. I was with him constantly. His heart condition." "His heart condition did not affect his mental capacity," Mr. Whitaker interrupted with quiet authority. "In fact, he specifically asked me to document his lucid state for exactly this reason. He suspected there might be challenges to his final wishes." The lawyer's diplomatic language couldn't disguise what everyone in the room now understood. Dad had known exactly what Karen was capable of and he'd planned accordingly. Karen tried one more time to interrupt, her voice rising to near hysteria. "This is manipulation. She's been plotting." But Mr. Whitaker's voice cut through her protests like a blade through silk. In 40 years of practice, he'd clearly learned how to command a room when necessary. "Mrs. Thompson, I would ask you to remain silent while I read the legally binding final wishes of the deceased." The room leaned forward collectively, a congregation transformed into an audience for the final act of a drama none of them had expected to witness. Even the children who had been restless earlier were now perfectly still, sensing the gravity of the moment even if they didn't understand its significance. Mr. Whitaker opened the document with ceremonial precision, adjusting his reading glasses as he began to speak in the formal cadence reserved for legal proceedings. "I, Thomas Mitchell, being of sound mind and body, do hereby revoke all previous wills and codicils and declare this to be my final will and testament." He paused, letting the weight of those words settle. "To my beloved daughter, Susan Mitchell, I leave everything I have built in this life." The specificity that followed was breathtaking. Not just my estate or my possessions, but a detailed catalog of everything Dad had worked for during his 57 years on Earth. The family home at 247 Oak Street, built with my own hands in 1992. I could picture him laying every beam, installing every fixture, the pride he'd taken in creating something lasting. Mitchell Construction LLC, including all equipment, ongoing contracts and business relationships. The business he'd started with nothing but a pickup truck and determination, now employing 12 people and with a reputation for quality that stretched across 3 counties. All bank accounts, investment portfolios, life insurance policies and retirement funds. Dad had been more financially successful than he'd ever let on, living modestly while building security for the future. For my future, as it turned out. Additionally, all personal property, tools, vehicles and sentimental items, including but not limited to the collection of vintage hand tools inherited from my father, my workshop and all its contents and every photograph, document and memento of our life together. With each item I could feel the weight of Dad's love, the careful thought he'd put into ensuring that every piece of our shared history would remain with me. But it was what came next that truly revealed the depth of his understanding. To Karen Thompson and her son Charles Thompson, Mr. Whitaker continued, his voice steady despite the explosive content, I leave nothing. They have actively and systematically worked to damage my relationship with my daughter through deception and manipulation. They are not my family and they have no claim to what I have built. The collective gasp from the congregation was like a physical force. Several people actually stood up slightly in their pews, unable to remain seated through such a devastating pronouncement. Dad's words weren't just legal language. They were a father's final judgment, delivered with the clarity of someone who had seen through years of careful deception. But Dad wasn't finished. Mr. Whitaker's voice grew stronger as he read the will's most damning passage. I have discovered that Karen Thompson has spent months telling my daughter that I no longer love her, while simultaneously telling me that Susan no longer wishes to see me. This systematic campaign of lies has cost me precious time with the most important person in my life. I will not allow it to cost Susan her rightful inheritance as well. The chapel erupted. Not in whispers this time, but in open conversation as people turned to their neighbors, processing the bombshell they'd just witnessed. Dad's business partner, Jim Reynolds, was shaking his head in obvious disgust while staring directly at Karen. I knew something was off, he said loud enough for half the room to hear. Tom asking me strange questions about Susan, wondering if she'd said anything about being unhappy with him. Now it all makes sense. Karen's composure finally shattered completely. She lunged toward Mr. Whitaker, her movements desperate and uncoordinated. Those documents are fake. He forged them. Thomas would never. But her path was blocked by a wall of Dad's friends and colleagues who had seen enough. Pete Garrison, built like the construction worker he'd been for 40 years, stepped directly into her path. Behind him, 3 other men from Dad's crew formed a protective barrier around the lawyer. Ma'am, I think you need to sit down, Pete said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that comes from years of managing construction sites. You've embarrassed yourself and dishonored Tom's memory enough for one day. Charles, meanwhile, had sunk into a pew, his head in his hands. The confident young man who'd spoken so boldly about inheritance just an hour earlier was gone, replaced by someone who looked lost and broken. I almost felt sorry for him. At 22, his entire sense of identity had been shattered in the span of 30 minutes. But it was my response that truly ended the chaos. In the center of the storm, surrounded by shouting voices and desperate protests, I remained perfectly calm. The anxiety that had plagued me for months was gone, replaced by something I hadn't felt since Dad and I had our last real conversation. Peace. You played your hand too early, Karen, I said, my voice somehow carrying over the noise without being raised. The chapel gradually quieted as people turned to hear what I would say next. I came here today prepared to honor Dad's memory and share his legacy with grace, I continued, meeting her eyes directly for the first time since her cruel whisper had started this entire confrontation. I was even willing to make sure you and Charles were taken care of, despite everything you'd done. I paused, letting that sink in. Several mourners nodded appreciatively. They knew me well enough to believe I would have shown such kindness, even to someone who didn't deserve it. But today, with your cruelty and your lies, with the way you tried to humiliate me at my own father's funeral, my voice grew stronger, more certain. You made the choice for both of us. The finality in those words seemed to deflate Karen's last burst of fight. She stood there, swaying slightly as the full weight of her losses became clear. Not just the inheritance she'd counted on, but her reputation, her standing in the community, and the respect she'd thought she'd earned through her marriage to my father. Karen stood there for another 10 seconds, swaying like a tree in a storm, before reality finally penetrated her shock. When it did, the transformation was immediate and ugly. Gone was any pretense of grief or dignity. In its place was pure, desperate rage. This isn't over, she screamed, her voice cracking with hysteria. I'll contest this. I'll expose her manipulation. Thomas wasn't thinking clearly. His heart condition affected his judgment. But even as she spoke, I could see her scanning the faces around us, searching for any hint of support or sympathy. She found none. Every eye that met hers held disgust, disappointment, or outright anger. These were people who had known our family for decades, who had watched me grow up, who had respected my father's character and judgment. Her accusations fell on deaf ears. Pete Garrison stepped forward again, his weathered face set in stone. Behind him, two more of Dad's crew members, both well over 6 feet and built like the construction workers they were, flanked him with crossed arms. They weren't threatening exactly, but their message was crystal clear. "Ma'am, I think it's time for you to leave," Pete said quietly. "You've done enough damage to Tom's memory for one day." Karen looked around desperately as if seeking an ally in the crowd. Her eyes fell on Charles, still sitting with his head in his hands, and something in her expression shifted from rage to panic. "Charles," she called out, her voice high and shrill. Tell them how much Thomas loved you. How he treated you like his real son." But Charles didn't look up. His shoulders were shaking and I realized he was crying, not the calculated tears his mother had deployed throughout the service, but the genuine grief of a young man whose entire world had just collapsed. When he finally raised his head, his face was streaked with tears and something that looked like shame. "Stop, Mom," he said quietly. Stop. Please." The defeat in his voice seemed to break something in Karen. For a moment her mask slipped completely, and I saw something almost human underneath. Fear, loss, the dawning realization that her carefully constructed life was crumbling around her. But the moment passed quickly, replaced by the calculating coldness I'd grown to recognize. "Fine," she said, straightening her shoulders with forced dignity. "We'll see what the courts have to say about this farce." Pete and his companions didn't need to say another word. They simply positioned themselves on either side of Karen and began walking toward the chapel's exit. It wasn't forceful, but it was unmistakably an escort. Karen had no choice but to walk between them, her heels clicking sharply against the floor in a staccato rhythm that echoed her growing panic. Charles followed silently behind, no longer the confident young man who had spoken so boldly about inheritance. He looked smaller somehow, diminished by the weight of truth. As they reached the chapel doors, Karen turned back one last time, her face twisted with fury and desperation. "This isn't over, Susan," she shouted. "I'll prove you manipulated him. I'll prove those documents are fake." But her threats rang hollow in the vast space, echoing off empty walls as the doors closed behind her. The silence that followed was different from the stunned quiet we'd experienced earlier. This was relief, the collective exhale of a community that had just witnessed justice served. The aftermath began immediately. Before I could even process what had happened, people were approaching me with tears in their eyes and apologies on their lips. Ruth was first, her small arms wrapping around me in a fierce hug that smelled like lavender and decades of love. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I should have known. I should have questioned what she was telling me." Others followed. Mrs. Henderson, who had known me since birth, clutched my hands and spoke through tears. "She told me you'd become distant, that you'd said Thomas wasn't really your father because you'd found your biological parents. I was so confused. It didn't sound like the Susan I knew, but grief makes people say strange things sometimes." Each conversation revealed another piece of Karen's systematic campaign of lies. Jim Reynolds, Dad's business partner, was particularly shaken. "She had me convinced you were angry about the business, that you thought Tom owed you more than just love. She said you told her that construction work was beneath you now that you had your fancy marketing job." The breadth of her deception was staggering. 4 months, Karen had been poisoning every relationship that mattered, carefully crafting lies that played on people's fears and insecurities. She told Dad's pastor that I'd become too sophisticated for small-town religion. She'd convinced his doctor that I was too busy with my career to visit a sick father. Each lie had been perfectly calibrated to isolate Dad from the people who loved him most. But perhaps the most heartbreaking revelation came from my godmother. Ruth pulled me aside as the crowd began to thin, her aged hands trembling as she spoke. "Susan, she told me you'd said that Thomas wasn't really your father," Ruth whispered, fresh tears streaming down her cheeks. "She said you'd done some kind of family tree research and discovered your real parents, and that you didn't need an old construction worker in your life anymore." The cruelty of that particular lie took my breath away. Ruth had been there when I was born, had held me as a baby, had been like a second mother throughout my childhood. For her to believe that I would ever say such things about Dad must have broken her heart. "She showed me text messages," Ruth continued, her voice barely audible. "Messages that she said were from you saying terrible things about Thomas. They seemed so unlike you, but she was so convincing, so heartbroken about the changes in you." Forged text messages. Karen's deception had been even more sophisticated than I'd imagined. She hadn't just relied on verbal lies, she'd manufactured evidence, created a paper trail of fake communications that painted me as ungrateful and cruel. Within days of the funeral, Karen's desperate attempts at legal challenge began and ended almost as quickly as they started. She hired Lawrence Briggs, a lawyer whose advertisements ran during daytime television. The kind of attorney who promised aggressive representation but delivered mostly empty threats. Mr. Whitaker kept me informed of her efforts, his updates delivered with the weary tone of someone who had seen such desperate moves before. "She's claiming undue influence," he told me during our first meeting after the funeral. "Alleging that you somehow coerced your father into changing his will while he was mentally incapacitated." But Karen had fatally miscalculated. The evidence against her was overwhelming. The DNA tests, the voice recording, the witnessed will, and most damaging of all, her own behavior at the funeral. Dozens of people had seen her cruelty, heard her lies, witnessed her complete lack of genuine grief. Briggs dropped her case within 2 weeks when Karen couldn't produce the retainer fee. The lawyer she'd thought she could afford with Dad's money was no longer an option when that money was legally mine. Charles, meanwhile, had vanished from town entirely. I heard through Ruth that he'd moved back east to live with Karen's sister, a woman who apparently had little patience for her nephew's entitled attitude and none for his mother's dramatic storylines. 3 weeks after the funeral, I finally found the courage to walk through the front door of the house I'd grown up in. Karen had changed the locks after Dad's death, but they were my locks now, my house, my responsibility. The place felt different without Dad's presence, but also somehow lighter, as if Karen's toxic energy had been cleansed along with her departure. I moved through the rooms slowly, reacquainting myself with spaces that held 33 years of memories. Dad's workshop drew me like a magnet. Karen had left it untouched, probably because she'd had no idea what any of the tools were worth or how to dispose of them. Everything was exactly as he'd left it. Hand tools hanging in perfect order on pegboard walls, half-finished projects sitting on workbenches, the smell of sawdust and machine oil that had always meant safety and love to me. On his desk, tucked beneath a stack of invoices, I found an envelope with my name written in Dad's careful handwriting. Inside was a letter dated just 5 days before his heart attack. "My dear Susan, I've been trying to find the courage to call you for weeks, but Karen keeps telling me you need space to work through your feelings about our relationship. I don't understand what I did to hurt you so badly, but I want you to know that I love you more than my own life. You are my greatest accomplishment, my brightest joy, and if I've somehow failed you as a father, I am truly sorry. I would do anything to make things right between us again. All my love, Dad." I read those words sitting in his chair, surrounded by the tools that had shaped both our lives, and finally let myself grieve. Not just for his death, but for the months of manipulation that had stolen our final opportunities to say these things to each other in person. But as I sat there in the workshop he'd built with his own hands, in the house that was now my sanctuary, I could feel his presence more clearly than I had since his death. Not the tired, defeated man Karen had presented to the world, but the father who had taught me to be strong, to stand up for what was right, and to never let anyone diminish my worth. He had waited until the very end to speak loud enough for the world to hear his love. And finally, sitting in his workshop with his letter in my hands, I could hear it perfectly. This story of calculated justice had you holding your breath. Smash that like button right now. My favorite part was when Susan calmly handed that envelope to the lawyer, knowing she'd been preparing for this exact moment. What was your favorite moment? Drop it in the comments below. Don't miss more incredible stories of truth triumphing over deception. Subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload.